So good evening and welcome to Chapter 15 for Bio 211, Anatomy and Physiology 1. We are looking at the comparison of somatic and autonomic nervous systems. I'm going to try and break the chapter up into two pieces. One is the construction and then the comparison and contrasting of the branches of the autonomic nervous system, namely the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. I'm going to set the stage right at the very beginning and remind you that from the perspective of this class, you want to understand that it's the parasympathetic nervous system that establishes homeostasis, and the function of the sympathetic nervous system is to temporarily push normal physiology out of its range to respond to whatever the situation is and then allow it to return back to normal. Okay, so having said that, I want to take just a minute here to remind you the somatic nervous system, of course, is the mixture of chapters 13 and 16 primarily, where you include both the sensory and motor neurons, where sensation is of the type of, or meaning the modality was the vocabulary I used last time, touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception, as well as the special senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium, are going to travel into the brain via the thalamus, with the exception, of course, of smell. And they will then allow, if need be, some sort of motor neuron output from that upper motor neuron to a lower motor neuron, what will innervate some form of skeletal muscle tissue that is voluntary. Okay? But this evening, what we're going to be focusing on is the reception of sensory input. Collectively, I would put in the word interoreceptor here, right? So interoreceptor. And those interoreceptors are going to collect information, and they're going to send it back primarily to the hypothalamus. And what's going to happen then, of course, your body is going to respond to the information that's traveled in. We're going to take a look first here at the somatic nervous system. And what I want you to remember is, here's the cell body. Let me see if I can do this without mucking things up. Cell body. Bam. Okay. Cell body of neuron, and this is the anterior rootlet of any one of the nerves that's exiting the spinal column. And you notice it's a myelinated neuron here, and you're going to notice that all somatic motor neurons release acetylcholine, and they will activate skeletal muscle tissue. That is a rule. Okay, there are no exceptions to that in this class. I guess I'm going to put review material in this for you as well. Remember, this is an A-type fiber, right? And that A-type fiber is going to allow for the fastest conduction of saltatory conduction type alongside the axon itself. Okay? Having said that, we're going to now move to the comparison. Let's get out of here. Notice all this is going to disappear now. Doink. Cool. And then we're going to move over here. And what I want us to do is compare and point out some things inside your textbook. Okay, so inside your textbook, there's a figure that actually has the somatic as well as the autonomic nervous system. And this is mislabeled, so I'm going to get rid of this here. I'm just going to go comparison of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Because that's actually what we're doing here. And what I mean by that is, let's go like this, let's go like this. And I want to bracket these two together, right? Sorry, it's red. It should be blue. But down here is this. And remember, this is sympathetic, and this is going to be parasympathetic. Okay? And we're going to walk you through this and pay attention to the vocabulary that I'm using and actually how I'm lining things up. These should be in the lateral gray horn of the spinal column, meaning all cell bodies of sympathetic preganglionic neurons arise in the lateral gray horns. They exit through the anterior rootlets. Magically, they travel as B-type fibers, and I'm joking when I say magically. There's no such way this happens magically. It's going to go to some form of a ganglion, where it will then activate the cell body of the sympathetic postganglionic neuron, which when activated will release the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? And you'll see inside our textbook we stress that coming from that postganglionic neuron, it should be norepinephrine. And the target tissues are, of course, glands, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac target structures, okay? And it's a lot more confusing this, but generally speaking, if you can remember these as the basic targets, you can see how we will create an antagonistic system between the autonomic nervous system arms. Okay, let me get out of here and see what I can do about that apple thing that just showed up in the middle of my presentation. It says I need to connect with the cloud. Goodbye, cloud. So now I'm going to start over here on this side of the cartoon. Okay, remembering that these are joined together. They're both sympathetic branches. Notice these should both be inside lateral gray horns. The difference between the upper structure here and the lower structure there is notice that we are not targeting a ganglion. We are traveling to the adrenal medulla, which is part of the adrenal gland, which is located on the top of your kidneys. And inside here you actually have a population of cells. These are chromaffin cells, and they respond to the acetylcholine, ACH, that's released to activate those. And what happens is the chromaffin cells now make epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then they just flood your body. Flood. Okay, and in doing so, any cell that actually has a receptor, that's supposed to say flood, believe it or not, okay, they'll flood your body, and any cell that has a receptor to epinephrine and norepinephrine, okay, will become activated. So again, these are sympathetic, and over here, these are parasympathetic. And you'll notice that down here, our parasympathetic preganglionic neuron is a B-type fiber as well. It will have its own family of ganglion structures, autonomic ganglion structures, where the cell body of the postganglionic neuron is an unmyelinated C-type fiber. And notice what it's doing is it's releasing acetylcholine to glands, smooth muscle, and heart tissue. And if you think about tissues, remember tissues of epithelia, muscle, connective tissue, and nervous system tissue, you can imagine that inside all of these structures, you're going to have mixtures of some of these throughout. So just keep an open mind when you're thinking about how this actually might all work. Okay. Cool. So, having told you that, let's move from there to a comparison at the table level. Okay? Where what I want to do is I want to, here it's correctly titled, okay, in table 15.1 inside your textbooks, where the somatic nervous system function, here's a good place to think about chapter 13, actually parts of 14 and 16 as well, when compared to the autonomic nervous system. And I don't really want to read this whole thing out to you, but you can see sensory input comes from interoreceptors and the special senses. Okay? Control of motor output is involuntary. Okay? I need you to see that. You need, whoa, that's not what I wanted to do with that. You want to see that this is involuntary from the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the brain, and the spinal cord. Okay? You have limited control of your cerebral cortex. If you want to test this, go ahead, tell your heart to stop beating. Okay? Don't do it. Okay? Just in case something bad happens. I'd hate to be blamed for that, but even if you tried to stop your breathing for a prolonged period of time, it would eventually start on its own without your help. Unless you're submerged in water or something, but whatever. There's usually a 2-neuron pathway where you have a preganglionic neuron that actually has to activate a postganglionic neuron. Okay, with the exception of the sympathetic nervous system, which has a preganglionic neuron that travels to those chromaffin cells inside the adrenal medulla. Okay. Neurotransmitters, generally speaking, acetylcholine is for all somatic motor outputs. Inside the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, remember from my cartoon a moment ago, we broke it down to acetylcholine for all preganglionic neurons. Okay? And then the distinction for the parasympathetic nervous system, we will use primarily acetylcholine. And for the sympathetic nervous system, we'll primarily use epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now we're going to think about the responses. contraction of smooth muscle, increased or decreased rate of contraction of the cardiac muscle itself, or increased or decreased secretions of glands. And here's a way to think about this. When you're learning about them, and you're going to see at the end of the chapter, I'm going to look at tables yet again, all of these have the potential to go up or down, which means there has to be some mechanism, namely a neurotransmitter, that's going to target a specific receptor for either the acetylcholine or the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. I don't know what happened there. Okay. What you can see is, let me see if I can do that. Epinephrine or norepinephrine. Having a rough time. Sorry about that, folks. That norepinephrine, which means not only are they acting antagonistically to one another, imagine sympathetic raises things and parasympathetic depresses them, but now each neurotransmitter can actually have an effect that would increase or decrease depending on the target tissue. Okay, so you can see we're actually adding some complexity to our system here. So how does it do it? We're going to start here inside the sympathetic nervous system. And if you go back to the beginning, you'll see all those little blue dots were located someplace specifically there in the lateral gray horns from T1 through L3. Okay? So that means, for the purpose of this class, you need to make sure you know that the sympathetic, let's go blue here. So let's change the color. Go back to blue. So it sort of matches it. That means you understand that all the preganglionic neurons on both sides, this is not just one side, they're both sides, okay? All the preganglionic neurons arise from here. They will travel into this sympathetic trunk ganglia. And like it says right here, on both sides, it's traveling up and down, okay? And that means that any one of these nerves will travel in here and may ascend or descend. But the important things to observe here is all of these solid lines, those are all B-type fibers. The things to see over here, all these hashed lines, those are those post-ganglionic C-type fibers. So now put the system together. Exits, synapses, activates to then target the tissue. And notice what the tissues are. They are glands, cardiac muscle, and the viscera of the body that is made up of all of those 4 different tissue types. Another thing to pay attention to here is that to separate the responsibilities, Mother Nature created a series of ganglion for the superior functions in the body, meaning towards the skull, okay, superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and inferior cervical ganglia, and then those that focus on the lower physiologic responsibilities. Collectively, they're part of what's called the prevertebral ganglia here. And as I said in class, it's not worth your time to memorize all of the pathways. It is, however, in your benefit to learn that the sympathetic nervous system has 3 cervical ganglia. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 prevertebral ganglia. Okay, you might want to pay attention to their names so you can distinguish them from the parasympathetic ganglia you will have to learn in a moment. Okay, there's not much else to tell you here other than Mother Nature has now figured out a way to synapse with all of the target tissues, and that's what you want to pay attention to here. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Change the slide. Put you down over here for just a moment so I don't mess anything up. And take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm going to change colors just because I'm trying to be facile and demonstrate that I can learn how to use technology. Yay, technology. In the last couple of minutes here, I just want to finish this slide off, walk through what we've already discovered, or, made sure you understood that there's going to be a population of preganglionic neurons that are all B-type fibers. Notice they're solid lines, B-type fibers, okay, that will synapse with a C-type fiber, and that C-type fiber will then innervate its target tissue. And notice what the target tissues are again. They're glands, it's cardiac muscle, and they're the tissues of the viscera of the body. Here's where things are interesting for our parasympathetic nervous system. I'm going to bring these two pieces together, and it's called craniosacral for a reason, because we have 4 cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, that work in conjunction with the pelvic splanchnic nerves. Now, there isn't anything funny to talk about all of this. Just understand that Mother Nature has much larger preganglionic neurons for the parasympathetic nervous system, because remember, she regulates homeostasis by preferentially activating the parasympathetic nervous system. To distinguish between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic, notice it's much easier to learn the terminal ganglia identifiers, meaning its ciliary, paratigo-palatine, submandibular, and otic ganglia. So if you can learn those 4 and remember that they're part of the terminal ganglia, it means you're part of this parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? Which means if you're asked anything else, chances are it's going to refer back to either the prevertebral or the cervical ganglia that we spoke about for the sympathetic nervous system in blue on the previous slide. Okay? So this is a pretty good place to stop, but I just want to make sure you see one thing here. I just want to go S versus P, where S stands for sympathetic, P stands for parasympathetic, and what's actually happening here is let's pick some random color here. I know what I'll do. I will pick, purple. I think it's a purple or something like that, right? Here's a heart, right? Here's a heart. And what I want to make sure you remember is that, generally speaking, we're going to have some parasympathetic influence over cardiac function that is antagonistic to the sympathetic function. Okay? So what we have to spend the rest of the time doing is learning how Mother Nature creates this antagonism and then establishes the ability to regulate it. Okay? Yeah, I'll be back in a couple minutes. Bye.